2 hours before the tragedy unfolded, the newlywed bride, Alina Rashid, stood in the softly lit honeymoon suite of the Marston Heights Hotel, carefully removing the layers of heavy bridal makeup she had worn for more than 12 hours, and as she wiped the final traces from her cheeks and examined her bare face in the mirror, she felt a rare sense of relief wash over her, because beneath the glitter, lashes, and lipstick, she finally saw the version of herself that Hamid always said he loved the most. Yet, for reasons she could not quite explain, the spacious room felt strangely colder than before, as though the expensive air conditioner had been set lower, or an unseen draft had slipped through the balcony door, prompting her to walk over and check if the lock was secure, which it was, though the sheer curtains fluttered faintly as if touched by an invisible hand, making her heartbeat quicken for just a moment before she forced herself to laugh it off and return to the vanity table, where her silver jewelry lay neatly arranged like museum pieces. And while she unclasped her necklace, she caught her reflection tilting her head in mild confusion, because she could have sworn she heard the soft click of the suite's main door, a sound so subtle she wondered if it was only in her imagination. But still she called out Hamid's name, receiving no answer, since her new husband had gone downstairs to meet a pair of late-arriving guests who insisted on congratulating him personally, leaving her alone in a room that suddenly felt too silent for comfort. And as she texted her older sister the unsettling message, "I feel like someone is here," she hesitated before typing, "Hamid is downstairs, so who walked past the door?" But she deleted the second line, convincing herself she was only being dramatic due to exhaustion. Yet her sister sensed something was off and immediately replied, "Are you okay? Want me to call?" A message that unfortunately remained unread, because by then Alina had walked toward the bathroom to change into a lighter nightdress, unaware of the fact that a dark silhouette had been captured just outside her door on the hallway security camera at exactly the same time her instincts began to warn her. A detail investigators would later find deeply disturbing, for the figure moved with deliberate calm rather than panic, suggesting familiarity with the building rather than the frantic energy of a random intruder. And while Alina folded her bridal dress and placed it on the back of a chair with meticulous care, her eyes occasionally darted to the corners of the room, as if waiting for something to step out of the shadowed areas. But nothing did, though her uneasiness grew when she noticed the faint scent of cologne in the air, one she did not recognize as Hamed's. Yet she brushed it aside, thinking perhaps a staff member who delivered the wedding fruit basket earlier had worn it. And as she dimmed the lights and slipped into bed, she felt the hairs on her arms lift in a quiet warning she struggled to ignore, because for a few seconds she was certain she heard slow breathing coming from somewhere behind her. But when she turned around, she saw only the familiar furniture and the faint outline of her suitcase propped against the wall. So she finally rested her head on the pillows, unknowingly entering the last hour of her life. For at 10:42 p.m., the hallway camera captured the same shadow figure lingering near her suite door again, though this time it stayed long enough to block part of the dim exit sign's glow. And at 11:06 p.m., the camera recorded nothing more, leaving a blank stretch of unmonitored time that would later become the central mystery of the case. And by midnight, when Hamid returned and made the cold, oddly calm emergency call, Paramedics found Alina dead on the bed without her underwear, with no signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle, and no physical evidence left behind, making the suite feel eerily untouched, almost staged, as though whoever had been inside knew exactly how to leave without being seen. And the only thing that would eventually guide investigators deeper into the truth was Alina's final unread message glowing quietly on her phone. Hamid Rashid sat in the dimly lit hotel lobby with his suit jacket folded neatly over his arm, greeting the later arriving guests with a smile that seemed warm on the surface but held an undercurrent of tension. And although he insisted he left the honeymoon suite only because Alina wanted time alone to remove her makeup and relax, investigators would later discover that his timeline was riddled with gaps that raised more questions than answers. For while the lobby's security camera recorded him speaking to the concierge at 9:57 p.m., and again sitting with a pair of cousins at 10:12 p.m., there was a crucial 15-minute window they could not account for, a window during which Hamid vanished from all visible camera angles, leaving room for speculation about whether he purposely navigated the hotel's blind spots, something only a person familiar with the building layout could manage. And although he firmly denied ever stepping onto the 7th floor during that gap, his voice on the emergency call felt strangely composed, lacking the raw panic expected from a husband discovering his bride lifeless only hours after their wedding, especially when he began his report with, "My wife isn't responding, and she's missing her underwear," a detail that struck Inspector Ishad as oddly emphasized, as if he wanted to direct suspicion toward an imagined intruder or a sexually motivated crime. Yet the scene itself contradicted that narrative, because there were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no disturbed furniture, no torn fabric, and no defensive wounds on the victim, making it appear that Alina may have been attacked by someone she knew, or someone who could enter the room without resistance. And when the paramedics arrived, they found Hamid sitting on the edge of the bed with an expression that looked more stunned than devastated, his eyes scanning their movements carefully, as though evaluating their reactions, while he kept repeating that he had been downstairs the whole time, a statement the staff supported at first, until Inspector Ishad interviewed the night manager, who admitted he briefly went to the storage room around the exact time Hamid disappeared from the cameras, meaning there was a 5-minute stretch during which no employee had witnessed Hamid's presence in the lobby. And though 5 minutes might seem insignificant, it mattered deeply in a case where the killer had likely moved with precision and confidence. And complicating matters further was a witnesser, hotel guest from the opposite hallway, who claimed she heard a soft knock on Alina's suite door at approximately 10:30 p.m., a detail Hamid dismissed by saying Alina was probably waiting for room service, though no such order had been placed. And while Hamid sat through questioning with collected composure, his responses occasionally drifted into rehearsed-sounding statements, especially when describing his marriage, emphasizing repeatedly that Alina was perfect, quiet, and never argued, phrases that caused Inspector Ishad to wonder if he was trying too hard to portray their relationship as flawless. And when she asked why he returned to the suite exactly when he did, he said he just felt like checking on her, a vague explanation that lacked instinctive emotional logic. For newlyweds typically return to their rooms sooner, not after hours of socializing. Yet Hamid insisted he stayed out longer, only because Alina wanted personal time, something her sister disputed when interviewed, claiming Alina was eager to rest with her husband and did not enjoy being alone in unfamiliar places. And this contradiction made the detectives question whether Hamid's version of events was shaped to fit his narrative rather than reality. But what troubled them the most was Hamid's reaction when they asked about the cologne scent Alina had noticed earlier. For, according to her sister, Alina mentioned the strange smell during a quick call just before the wedding ceremony ended. And when the investigators brought this up, Hamid's expression froze for a fraction of a second before he brushed it off, claiming he had changed fragrances midway through the evening. Yet the scent paramedics described at the scene did not match any bottle found among his belongings. And as the detectives pieced together the timelines, they realized Hamid's alibi depended entirely on fragmented memories, partial surveillance coverage, and scattered testimonies that could be interpreted in multiple ways, making him neither provably guilty nor convincingly innocent. And while the officers reviewed the hallway footage, they noticed the shadowy figure appearing near the suite twice, moving calmly and with purpose, prompting them to consider a chilling possibility. Either Hamid was lying, or someone else with intimate access to the couple had been inside that hotel. Someone who knew how to move unseen, someone with a motive yet undiscovered. And as Inspector Ished looked at Hamid's steady eyes during questioning, she sensed he was hiding something, whether it was guilt, fear, or a dangerous truth yet to be revealed. She could not tell, but she knew the case had only just begun. Alina's older sister, Maryam Rashid, arrived at the Marston Heights Hotel before sunrise, her face pale with shock as she pushed past the yellow police tape, demanding answers with a voice that trembled between fury and heartbreak. And though the officers tried to calm her, she insisted on speaking directly to Inspector Ishad, explaining that Alina had never been the type to feel paranoid without reason, especially on a night meant to be the happiest of her life. And as she pulled out her phone to show the final unread message, "I feel like someone is here," the detective felt a subtle shift in the entire investigation, because this message implied not only fear but recognition. Alina had sensed a presence, one she didn't identify as dangerous enough to flee from, implying perhaps she expected someone familiar, someone she knew. And as Maryam recounted their last conversation earlier that evening, she revealed that Alina had confessed feeling strange energy around certain wedding guests, particularly mentioning Hamid's cousin, a man with an unnerving habit of staring too long and appearing unexpectedly behind people, although Alina had laughed it off, saying he was probably just socially awkward. Yet Maryam remembered her sister whispering that Kamran had followed her twice during the wedding photo session, standing too close even when there was no need. And now, with Alina dead under circumstances that felt too deliberate, Maryam's instincts buzzed with the conviction that something far more sinister had unfolded. And she told the detective that Alina had also experienced a disturbing moment during the wedding reception when she smelled an unfamiliar cologne on someone who brushed past her, sharp, metallic, and icy as though the scent belonged to a person who intended to be remembered. Yet when she turned, she saw no one she could confidently accuse. And what troubled Maryam most was that Alina mentioned this cologne again in their final exchange, just minutes before she began removing her makeup in the suite, saying, "That smell, is here again. A detail that now aligned eerily with the paramedics' report describing an unusual fragrance lingering near the bed, one not identified as Hamid's, making Maryam question whether someone else with access to the wedding had secretly followed them to the hotel. And when Inspector Ishad asked whether Alina had ever mentioned marital concerns or fears related to Hamid, Maryam shook her head vigorously, insisting that, although Alina had occasional doubts about Hamid's temper, especially during a brief argument about wedding expenses 2 weeks prior, she had never expressed fear of him, in fact claiming he always treated her gently, which complicated the detective's assumptions. Yet Maryam also recalled a chilling incident from 3 months earlier, when an anonymous message was sent to Alina's phone reading, "You think you're safe," which Alina had dismissed as a prank from an unrecognized number. But now, standing in the sterile cold of the hotel room where her sister had died, Maryam realized everything aligned too closely to coincidence, and her voice cracked as she described how Alina would never, under any circumstance, willingly remove her underwear while alone in a hotel room unless preparing to sleep or change clothes. Yet the timing made no sense, because Alina was still fully dressed in her nightdress when found, which meant someone had removed that undergarment after her death or, worse, right before it, making the crime feel less impulsive and more calculated. And as Maryam stared at the untouched furniture and flawless placement of objects, she whispered that Alina was meticulous, meaning any disturbance would have been immediately obvious to her, suggesting the killer moved with absolute precision and purpose, leaving no trace behind. And when Inspector Ishad pressed further, asking about potential past suitors or people obsessed with Alina, Maryam hesitated before mentioning a man named Rayyan who had proposed to Alina years ago but reacted angrily when she declined, disappearing abroad shortly afterward, though he recently returned to the city, according to a mutual friend. A revelation that made the detective pause, sensing the investigation had taken a darker turn, because now there were multiple men with potential motives: Hamid with his suspicious alibi gaps, Kamran with his unsettling behavior, and Rayyan with a history of fixation. And as Maryam finally broke down in tears, whispering, "She texted me because she knew something wasn't right," Inspector Ishad felt a growing certainty that Alina's death was not the result of a random intrusion, but a carefully orchestrated act, carried out by someone with deep emotional ties to the victim, someone whose presence in the hotel that night was not accidental but anticipated, and whose identity was now hidden in the shadows of secrets the family had yet to reveal. Inspector Ishad sat inside the hotel's small security office, surrounded by a wall of flickering screens showing time-stamped footage from every corridor, elevator, and lobby entrance. And as she replayed the recordings from the hours leading up to Alina's death, she noticed something unsettling about the shadowy figure captured outside the suite, because, although the person's face was never visible, their movements were far too calm, almost rehearsed, as if they knew exactly where the cameras pointed and how to avoid being fully seen, which suggested a familiarity with the building that random intruders simply didn't possess. And when she slowed the footage at 10:42 p.m., she saw the figure pause directly in front of the suite, standing motionless for nearly 8 seconds, a detail that sent a chill down her spine, because the stillness conveyed intent rather than hesitation. And as she enhanced the contrast, she noticed a faint glimmer near the figure's hand, something metallic, possibly a room keycard, implying the intruder had access rather than brute-forcing entry. And this access could only come from three sources: hotel staff, one of the guests, or someone who acquired a duplicate key through manipulation or theft, making the suspect pool larger, yet more focused at the same time. And while the footage did not capture the person entering the room, it showed the hallway going mysteriously empty for the next 24 minutes, a gap that aligned disturbingly well with the estimated time of Alina's death, leading the inspector to suspect the killer had slipped into the suite during an unmonitored interval, taking advantage of a camera blind spot created by an architectural recess near the fire extinguisher. A blind spot so perfectly placed that only someone who had studied the layout or tested it beforehand would know how to use it. And as she reviewed older footage from earlier that day, she realized the same shadowy figure had appeared briefly near the ballroom exit during the wedding reception, keeping their back turned to the camera while adjusting their sleeve. And although the movement seemed casual, the timing was too precise, occurring exactly when the bridal party exited the hall toward the parking area, which raised the possibility that the killer had been following Alina long before she ever stepped foot inside the honeymoon suite. And when the inspector zoomed in, she saw something else: an unusual flicker of patterned fabric on the person's arm, something resembling a textured weave rather than a typical suit, a pattern that looked alarmingly similar to the jacket worn by Hamid's cousin Cameron at the wedding, though the resolution was too low to confirm it. And the realization forced her to consider whether Kamran's odd behavior around Alina had been mere social awkwardness or something more sinister. Yet she couldn't ignore another detail. At exactly 11:06 p.m., the figure appeared again, but farther down the hallway, walking with slow, confident steps toward the emergency stairwell, shoulders relaxed, posture upright, without even a glance behind them, as though they were not fleeing a crime, but simply following a predetermined exit route. And the timestamp aligned perfectly with the time Hamid's voice sounded strangely calm on the emergency call, making the inspector contemplate a disturbing possibility that the killer had left just moments before Hamid returned, suggesting either a careless coincidence or deliberate timing meant to frame him. Because if Hamid was innocent, then someone manipulated the situation to make him look guilty. But if he was involved, then perhaps he had an accomplice who acted while he maintained an alibi downstairs, a theory that grew stronger when she viewed footage from the lobby at 10:55 p.m. showing Hamid pacing near the elevators, glancing repeatedly at his phone as though awaiting a message or signal, contradicting his earlier claim that he had been engaged in casual conversation with guests the entire time. And what troubled the inspector further was the realization that when the figure disappeared into the stairwell, the camera inside the stairwell, one that should have captured their descent, had been conveniently disabled due to a maintenance malfunction, something the night technician reported happened at only 2 cameras in the entire building, both located near the honeymoon suites, making the inspector conclude that either the malfunction was sabotage or someone inside the hotel had assisted the killer. And as she leaned back in her chair, replaying the shadowy silhouette gliding across the corridor like a ghost with purpose. She felt the knot of dread tighten in her stomach, because the figure moved not like a stranger, but like someone who anticipated every detail, every blind spot, every second of opportunities, someone whose presence at the wedding was not a coincidence, and whose motive ran deeper than jealousy or chance. And as she paused the footage on a single frame, catching the faint outline of the patterned sleeve, she whispered to herself that the killer was not just someone close to the couple, but someone dangerously close. Kamran Yusuf, Hamid's cousin, arrived at the police station wearing the same patterned jacket that had caught Inspector Ishad's attention in the security footage. A choice so bold it almost felt mocking, as if he either had nothing to hide or wanted the investigators to believe he didn't. And when he entered the interrogation room with a lazy smile and casual confidence, the inspector instantly sensed the unsettling charm Alina had described to her sister. For Kamran carried himself with the poised arrogance of someone who believed rules were suggestions and consequences were for other people, not him. And as he sat down and adjusted his sleeves with deliberate care, Inspector Ishad noticed how perfectly the weave, texture, and angle of the pattern matched the flicker she had seen in the hallway footage, tightening her suspicion. Yet she also knew criminals sometimes mimicked evidence to mislead investigations, and so she kept her expression neutral while asking him to describe his whereabouts between 10:20 p.m. and 11 p.m. on the night of Alina's death, a question that caused his smooth demeanor to waver ever so slightly before he claimed he had been in the hotel bar having a drink alone, a statement the inspector immediately checked against footage, finding that Kamran indeed appeared in the bar at 10:21 p.m., but vanished by 10:32 p.m., reappearing again only at 11:09 p.m., a gap that aligned disturbingly well with the killer's movement in the hallway. And though Kamran attempted to explain the gap by saying he went outside to smoke near the back entrance where cameras didn't reach, the inspector noted that his jacket, when viewed up close, carried no trace of outdoor smell, no cold night air, nothing but a faint, unfamiliar cologne that matched the description given by both Alina and the paramedics. And when she mentioned this, Kamran smirked and said he had been trying a new fragrance he bought overseas, twisting the story to make it sound like a coincidence. Yet his reaction was too quick, too smooth, indicating he had anticipated that question. And as the inspector observed him closely, she noticed the way he tapped his fingers rhythmically against the table, a restless yet oddly calculated gesture, as though he was counting seconds or replaying memories he needed to keep straight. And when she shifted the conversation toward Alina, asking casually if he liked her, he chuckled softly and said everyone liked Alina. But when she pressed further, asking if he liked her too much, something cold flickered in his eyes for a fraction of a second before he leaned back and said she was beautiful. Yes, but not his type. Although the detective sensed his answer carried the slippery evasiveness of someone who had thought about her far more than he admitted. And when she brought up the reports that he had followed Alina during the wedding photo session, Kamran shrugged and claimed he was simply trying to help the photographer by holding her bouquet, a statement that contradicted to witnesses who said he didn't hold anything but stood watching her with unusual intensity. And while the inspector filed that contradiction mentally, she also noted how defensive Kamran became when she asked about the keycard access logs, especially when she mentioned that someone had used a staff master key to open several doors on the 7th floor that evening, including the honeymoon suite. And although Kamran insisted he had no idea how master keys worked, the inspector noticed him momentarily freeze, as if recalling a detail he hadn't prepared an excuse for, before quickly laughing it off and accusing the hotel of poor security. Yet the most disturbing revelation came when she asked about his relationship with Hamid, because, rather than describing cousinly closeness, Kamran hesitated before saying they tolerated each other, revealing a tension that hinted at deeper resentment, something far more personal than petty jealousy. And when pressed, Kamran confessed that Hamid had once accused him of flirting with Alina months before the wedding, which Kamran dismissed as paranoia. Yet the inspector saw the way he clenched his jaw when speaking her name, a sign of unspoken obsession rather than indifference. And as their interrogation continued, Kamran suddenly leaned forward and asked, with a chilling half-smile, "Do you really think I'd kill someone on their wedding night? That's cinematic, not real life," a remark that struck the inspector as disturbingly self-aware, as if he viewed the entire situation like a movie where he could outsmart the script. And when she finally let him go for lack of definitive evidence, he walked out of the room with the same calm confidence as the shadow in the footage, pausing at the doorway to adjust his sleeve in a way so precise, so familiar, that it sent a shiver through her. Because Kamran looked like a man who enjoyed being suspected, someone who wanted to be part of the mystery. Whether guilty or not, Tand, she realized with a sinking feeling that if he was the killer, he wouldn't stop at outsmarting the police. He would relish it. The forensic team arrived at the Marston Heights Hotel with their kit, gloves snapping into place, eyes scanning the immaculate suite where Alina Rashid's body had been discovered. And as they began photographing the scene, dusting for prints, and collecting fibers, it became immediately clear that the killer had exercised extraordinary caution, leaving behind only the faintest trace of evidence. Because while the bed linens, nightdress, and surrounding furniture remained perfectly undisturbed, a meticulous examiner discovered a tiny smear of an unusual cologne on the edge of the pillowcase, a scent chemically distinct from anything registered in Hamid's collection, which matched the description Mariam had given of the mysterious fragrance Alina had sensed before her death. And under the corner of the nightstand, the forensic team found a single fingerprint not belonging to the victim or the husband, a partial ridge pattern that could not be immediately matched to any known hotel guest or staff, raising the possibility that the killer had somehow obtained a temporary keycard, bypassed standard access protocols, and moved within the suite without leaving any signs of struggle. And though there were no blood spatter patterns beyond the immediate area of the bed, a faint smear on the carpet suggested the victim had been briefly held or repositioned, a detail subtle enough that it could have been overlooked by anyone not trained to notice the slightest inconsistencies in the environment. And when they examined Alina's phone, they discovered that the last photo taken before her death was a mirror selfie with her makeup partially removed, showing an expression of subtle unease, her eyes wide, lips slightly parted, and a shadow cast behind her that aligned perfectly with the shape seen on the security footage, meaning the shadowy figure had been inside the suite even before any signs of forced entry. and the timestamp on that photo placed it just minutes before Hamid returned from the lobby, confirming that the killer's movements were precise and premeditated, carefully orchestrated to avoid detection while executing their objective. And the forensic team also noted that Alina's jewelry was untouched. No strands of hair were forcibly removed, and no fibers from clothing other than her own were found on the bed, indicating the attack had been carried out by someone both skilled and familiar with her habits. Perhaps someone who had observed her routine for days or weeks. And when they analyzed the collected fibers from the nightstand corner, a rare synthetic material was detected, used in expensive bespoke clothing, which narrowed the suspect pool to individuals with access to high-end fashion or wealthy connections. And the team found minute traces of dirt on the suite carpet, inconsistent with the hotel's standard cleaning, suggesting that someone had stepped in and out of the suite quickly, leaving behind barely perceptible physical markers of their presence. And further analysis of the fingerprint revealed partial loops and arches indicative of a young adult male, though the match would require advanced database comparison, a process taking days. And when the lead forensic officer combined all these findings, the cologne, the fingerprint, the fiber, the dirt pattern, and the timing of the phone photo, it became clear that the killer's precision was almost surgical, moving with a cold, calculating logic that left no emotional traces behind. A stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the family and the carefully constructed alibis of those closest to the victim. And as Inspector Ishad reviewed the forensic report in the quiet of her office, she felt an unnerving certainty that whoever had entered that room had done so with intimate knowledge of the layout, of Alina's habits, and of the camera blind spots. Confirming a chilling reality, this was no random crime of opportunity. This was an act of deliberate, intimate malice, carried out by someone who knew exactly how to leave nothing behind, yet create maximum psychological impact. And as she closed the folder and stared at the hotel's blueprint once more, she realized that the evidence, though minimal, painted a portrait of a killer whose mind was as precise and controlled as a surgeon's, someone capable of orchestrating terror in silence, and someone who might already be watching her every move, waiting for the next calculated step in a deadly game. The investigation took a sharp turn when Inspector Ishad requested a full review of all hotel staff schedules and access logs, because every employee who had keys or clearance to the 7th floor suites now fell under intense scrutiny. And while most staff members were cooperative, a junior receptionist named Faison displayed subtle signs of nervousness that immediately caught the inspector's attention. For when asked about the night of Alina's death, he hesitated, fidgeted with the edge of his uniform, and stammered slightly, insisting he had been stationed at the main desk. Yet the access logs showed that the elevator nearest to the honeymoon suite had been called multiple times between 10:35 p.m. and 10:55 p.m., the same window during which the shadowy figure had appeared outside Alina's suite. And while Faison claimed he didn't touch the elevator, surveillance footage revealed faint shadows moving near the control panel in an angle consistent with his height and posture, prompting Ishad to press harder, and under subtle but firm questioning, Faison admitted that he had been sent by the night manager to deliver an urgent maintenance notice to the 7th floor at exactly 10:40 p.m., a confession he tried to frame as a routine task, Yet the inspector noticed that his story didn't fully explain why he lingered near Alina's door for almost 2 minutes without knocking or leaving. A pause long enough for someone with malicious intent to slip inside unnoticed. And although Faison insisted he never entered the suite and had no reason to do so, Ishad couldn't ignore the cologne smell reported by paramedics and noticed on the hallway footage, because witnesses later identified the fragrance as one he had worn for a few days as part of a gift sent by a relative, something that would have made him immediately recognizable had anyone paid attention, and further complicating matters. Faison's personal cell phone records revealed multiple brief calls and messages exchanged with Kamran's number just hours before the wedding, a connection that neither man had disclosed voluntarily, suggesting a coordination previously hidden from investigators. And when confronted, Faison admitted he had been asked to check certain floors for suspicious activity by someone he refused to name, citing fear for his employment, a statement that implied insider knowledge of premeditation, because it suggested the possibility that the shadow figure was not acting alone but with the implicit assistance or silent complicity of hotel staff. And as Ishad reviewed the elevator and hallway blind spots once again, she realized that between Faison's temporary absence from the main desk, the timed intervals of camera malfunction, and the security blind corners, the killer could have moved freely for at least 20 minutes without detection, a span sufficient to commit the crime and stage the room to appear untouched. And although Faison maintained that he had no motive, the inspector couldn't ignore the nervous glances, the inconsistent statements, and the unusual cologne, all subtle indicators of a possible accomplice. And when she expanded her investigation to the night manager, he admitted that 2 employees had complained about unusual instructions that evening, but he had dismissed it as standard pre-wedding chaos, a revelation that made the inspector suspect that multiple people had knowingly ignored red flags, either out of fear or convenience. And while reviewing phone logs, surveillance, and staff movements together, it became apparent that the carefully timed arrival of Hamid, the shadowy figure, and the elevator movements were too synchronized to be coincidental, implying planning, rehearsal, or intimate knowledge of the building layout. And the inspector noted that Faison's fear of retaliation, combined with his connection to Kamran, painted a portrait of a young man caught between obedience and complicity, someone whose minor decisions may have facilitated a major crime. And as she compiled the notes, she realized that uncovering the staff's secrets might finally reveal how the killer accessed the room undetected, leaving the innocent suite staged and Alina's final moments hidden in plain sight. Because the crime had been executed not just with intent but with insider knowledge, precision timing, and calculated psychological manipulation, making every single person who interacted with the couple on that night a potential piece of a larger, more dangerous puzzle. The case took a decisive turn when the forensic team finally released the results of the detailed analysis conducted in Alina's suite, revealing minute traces of DNA on the edge of her nightdress, fingerprints on the jewelry she had meticulously folded, and the faintest fibers that matched the patterned jacket seen in the hallway footage. And although the room had initially appeared untouched, these microscopic clues proved otherwise, indicating that the perpetrator had handled objects with an extreme degree of care, leaving almost nothing for the untrained eye to detect. and as Inspector Ished examined the forensic report, she realized that the combination of DNA fibers and the distinct cologne residue formed a narrative pointing to someone who had both proximity and intent, because these were not the marks of a random intruder, but of a person who had observed, timed, and planned every action to manipulate both the environment and the perception of witnesses. And when she reviewed the fingerprints more closely, the lab confirmed a partial match to Kamran Yusuf, though not enough for immediate arrest, which meant the prosecution would need corroborating evidence. And in parallel, the DNA samples found near the hem of the nightdress and on the folded jewelry box revealed a second, unidentified profile that did not match any guest, staff member, or Hamid, hinting at the possibility of an accomplice or a third party previously unconsidered, a revelation that added layers of complexity to an already tangled investigation. And as she cross-referenced the fiber evidence, it became clear that the sleeve pattern observed in the footage and now physically present in the suite had been transferred from someone's clothing to the bedding and nightdress, reinforcing the notion that Kamran or someone wearing a similar jacket. Yet, the DNA anomaly suggested the presence of a second individual, someone careful enough to leave no fingerprints, but careless enough for their skin cells to transfer. And this discovery prompted a deeper review of the hotel's entry logs, revealing discrepancies in room key usage that matched the timeline of the shadowy figure, who appeared in the hallway before Hamid returned, which raised chilling questions about premeditation and coordination. And the team also discovered subtle, nearly invisible bruising patterns on Alina's wrists and ankles that were not apparent at first glance, consistent with a brief but restrained struggle, implying she had attempted to resist before the fatal act, which contradicted early assumptions that she had been overpowered instantly. And further chemical analysis of the cologne traces identified compounds uncommon in commercial perfumes, a signature blend sold only in select international stores, suggesting that whoever had worn it had deliberately chosen it to leave a faint but unique marker, either as a signature or a means to confuse investigators. And when this detail was combined with the precise timing of elevator and hallway blind spots, the calculated absence of surveillance in critical moments, and the staff's partial complicity, a terrifying pattern emerged. This was a meticulously orchestrated murder, executed with knowledge of both the hotel's architecture and human behavior, designed to appear as a chaotic, accidental event while leaving the investigator enough subtle clues to eventually uncover the truth. And as Inspector Ishad reviewed every piece of forensic evidence side by side with video footage, staff testimonies, and Hamid's alibi inconsistencies, she felt a sudden clarity, realizing that the case was not only about identifying a killer, but uncovering a network of hidden relationships, secret communications, and silent cooperation that had enabled a seemingly impossible crime. And she knew that, without careful triangulation of these details, the identity of the perpetrator or perpetrators would remain hidden, like shadows in the night, until another life was endangered. Inspector Ishad knew the investigation had reached a critical point when the collected evidence, the shadowy hallway footage, Kamran's patterned jacket, the DNA anomalies, the cologne traces, and the suspicious staff activity painted a web of connections too precise to ignore. And after obtaining a warrant, she arranged a formal confrontation with Kamran in a secured interrogation room, where the tension in the air was almost tangible. The single overhead light casting sharp shadows across his angular features as he leaned back casually, seemingly unbothered, though every subtle movement, the tapping of his fingers, the slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed a man who was calculating, measuring, and testing the limits of his own audacity. And as Ishad presented the forensic findings one by one, detailing the DNA found on Alina's nightdress that did not match any staff or guests, the fiber transfer from his jacket, and the cologne uniquely identified on multiple surfaces, Kamran listened with that faint, unsettling smirk that suggested amusement rather than fear. And when confronted with the timeline showing him unaccounted for during the crucial 24 minutes on the 7th floor, he tilted his head slightly, pretending confusion, before offering an almost mocking explanation that he had stepped away from the bar to make a phone call outside, a claim contradicted by CCTV footage and phone location data. Yet he maintained a calm, composed demeanor, forcing Ishad to carefully measure her questions and responses, because his confidence indicated both intelligence and danger. And when she pressed further about his connection to the hotel staff, particularly Kamran's expression shifted just enough to reveal a flicker of tension, though he quickly masked it with a casual shrug. And as she laid out the evidence of the cologne, the fingerprints, and the suspicious movement in the stairwell, she noticed that Kamran's eyes briefly darted to the ceiling, a micro-expression betraying inner calculation, the kind of subtle gesture trained psychologists associate with someone formulating lies or contingency plans. And when she asked directly why he had been near the honeymoon suite during Alina's final hours, he leaned forward slowly, hands clasped together, and whispered with a chilling calm, "I was merely in the corridor, observing. Isn't it normal to be curious?" A statement that deflected responsibility, yet implicitly acknowledged proximity. And, as Ishad countered by pointing out the cologne matching what the paramedics detected, the fibers from his jacket on Alina's nightdress, and the shadows captured on CCTV, Kamran's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he leaned back again, claiming coincidence, framing the entire sequence as an unfortunate chain of events that anyone could have fallen into. Yet the forensic evidence was precise and undeniable, and Ishad saw the tension in his jaw, the almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on the chair, signs that the calculated confidence he displayed was a fragile mask over panic. And when she finally presented the access logs showing the unauthorized master key activity on the 7th floor, including the window, Kamran's calm veneer cracked just enough for a subtle sigh to escape, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with a flicker of recognition that he had been caught in a net too tight to escape. And the room fell silent as the weight of evidence pressed on him, proving not only his presence but suggesting motive, obsession, and premeditation. And as the inspector concluded the session, she realized that while Kamran would continue to resist confession, the combination of physical evidence, digital proof, and his subtle behavioral cues had finally turned the tide in the investigation, leaving only the final unraveling of truth pending, a truth that would expose the sinister orchestration behind Alina's death, and the dangerous web that had put multiple lives in jeopardy. The final chapter of the investigation began in a hushed courtroom, where the accumulation of evidence, the shadowy hallway footage, Kamran's patterned jacket fibers, the DNA traces on Alina's nightdress, the cologne uniquely identified at the scene, the suspicious elevator and stairwell movements, and the complicity of certain hotel staff was laid bare before the jury. And as Inspector Ishad recounted the meticulous timeline, connecting every seemingly small detail into a coherent narrative, she emphasized how each element pointed inexorably to Kamran as the orchestrator of Alina's murder, carefully planning her death to coincide with the brief period when Hamid's alibi was solid yet left gaps that could be exploited to shift suspicion. And though Kamran maintained a composed exterior, subtle micro-expressions, twitching fingers, fleeting eye movements, the faintest tightening of his lips betrayed the anxiety beneath his otherwise calm facade, while the prosecution methodically detailed how he had exploited staff routines, used knowledge of the hotel's blind spots, and coordinated with Faison to move undetected, highlighting that the cologne chosen deliberately acted as both a signature and a psychological misdirection. And as Ishad described the DNA match, linking him directly to Alina's clothing and the fiber transfers from his jacket to the suite, the courtroom seemed to collectively shudder under the weight of premeditation revealed, because these were not accidental traces but deliberate imprints left by a man who wanted both control and recognition without being caught. And the testimonies of hotel employees corroborated that during the critical 20-minute window, movements had been unusually synchronized, with Faison's hesitancy and Kamran's disappearance aligning perfectly to create the illusion of an innocent, unmonitored corridor. And when the jurors viewed the enhanced security footage showing the shadowy figure lingering outside the suite, pausing deliberately and then vanishing into the stairwell, the evidence painted a picture of someone who knew the building intimately and could navigate it with precise timing, while Hamid's testimony, reinforced by multiple independent witnesses, confirmed he was genuinely absent during the time of the murder, effectively exonerating him and emphasizing that the crime was committed with intentional deception to create suspicion elsewhere. And the prosecution then detailed the psychological aspect, Kamran's obsession with Alina, documented through witness statements, previous interactions, and the chilling text messages Miriam had revealed, combined with his behavioral patterns during interrogation, illustrated a mindset fixated on control, obsession, and performance. And when the forensic team testified, presenting physical proof of DNA, fiber, and cologne matching the suspect, the case solidified into an airtight chain of cause and effect, leaving little room for doubt. And as Ishad summarized the orchestration, how Kamran used blind spots, staff cooperation, and precise timing to execute the murder and create a misleading narrative, the room seemed to absorb the full extent of the calculated crime, realizing it was not impulsive but methodical, designed to manipulate perception, exploit human assumptions, and stage Alina's final moments as almost ordinary, yet leaving microscopic traces that, when pieced together, revealed a sinister mastery of planning, psychology, and opportunism. And finally, when the jury returned a unanimous verdict, the courtroom exhaled collectively, acknowledging that justice had been achieved. But Ishad knew the case would linger in memory not just as a solved murder, but as a chilling reminder of how obsession, planning, and intimate knowledge of human and environmental behavior could converge to create a crime so precise that only patient, meticulous investigation could unveil the horrifying truth, leaving Cameron's name forever linked to the death of Alina and the shadowy corridors that concealed his deadly intent.